Hey there, this is Silversmithing 111, and today we're going to be making droplets, which are a great way to add little bits of accents to your jewelry work, as well as creating different textures. So you can do this with just about any precious metal. Silver, gold are the most common. So real simple process. Let's get right into it. Okay, by now you've probably accrued quite a bit of scrap silver, and that's just fine. For this project, you're just going to pick out a few pieces of wire here and a small piece of sheet, which we're going to attach the droplets to. So for now, you can set the sheet aside and just pick out your wire here. And you're just going to snip them into some shorter sizes here using your flush cutters. So if I just snip it like this, it's going to go flying. So what I like to do is put the wire through the flush cutter and I push it down on the table. And that just keeps the piece of wire from flying off into space. So I'm just snipping these off at about 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch intervals here. And once you've done that, we're going to go ahead and melt these down. Now I've got quite an assortment of these little pieces here. I'm going to set these on my charcoal block like so. And we're just going to spread them out a little bit. We don't want them to melt together while we're melting. We want to form individual droplets. After you've done that, go ahead and grab your torch. Get that lit. You want to produce a flame. It's pretty strong, but not going to be blowing real hard because you don't want to blow your bits of silver around here. Go ahead and turn on your exhaust fan. You want to do that anytime you're working with your flame. You just aim straight down over a piece of silver here. And you can see it just beads right up like that. I'm going to zoom in the camera. If a couple of them merge together, that's okay. It's really nice to have an assortment of sizes. So this is pretty easy to do. The camera is not showing it very well, but each time I do this, it smelts the silver real quickly. Just like that. So once it's melted a piece of silver, you don't have to heat it anymore. It'll just naturally solidify into a little droplet. So go ahead and melt down a bunch of droplets and practice that for a bit. All right, I've moved all of these off and set them over here on my soldering board to cool. The cool tile will pull the heat out of these, making them easier to work with. I'm not going to pickle these just yet because putting all of these in the pickle and then pulling them out again can be incredibly tedious. And since I'm going to be pickling the final piece, it's not necessary to pickle each of these little individual components. So for the next step, we're going to want to try to solder these onto our sheet. Now, here's the important thing. If I set the sheet here and I put a droplet on it, and then if I were to set the solder adjacent to the droplet and heat this up, because this droplet is so small, there's a good chance that it will absorb the heat faster than the sheet, and the solder could just float up on top of our droplet, and then it will not be connected to the sheet, and then our droplet will be covered in solder, which is not ideal. So what we want to do is we want to pre-solder these pieces. And this is where a piece of this honeycomb board comes in handy because of all these little holes. It helps to hold my droplet with the flat side facing up. So I'm going to take some of these, just a couple for now, and I'm going to position them on the board with the flat side facing up. All right, next you're going to want to grab some solder. And the solder you pick for this is going to depend on at what point you are in the project you're working on. If you're adding the droplets to the project at the beginning, you're going to want to use hard solder so that future soldering operations can be done with a softer solder. If you're towards the end of your project, you're probably going to want to go with an easier solder. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to be using a medium solder. And so you're going to take your solder, and what I like to do here is to flatten out the solder a little bit so that it doesn't roll off of my droplets. To do this, just come over to one of your anvils or flat working surface, and I like to use a brass hammer so I don't put dents in my anvil here. And just lightly flatten the wire. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and snip off a few pieces here. These are going to be really small so that they'll fit on the surface of our beads here. So I'm just going to cut a couple of these off, 3 of them since I have 3 beads. Next, what you're going to want to do before you add the solder to the bead, go ahead and take your flux and apply the flux to the little droplets here. Then go ahead and pick up your solder, set one piece on each droplet. After you've got the solder on each droplet here, we're going to go ahead and turn on our torch. Nice medium flame here. Doesn't need to be very big, so I have a small flame. And we're just going to melt the solder onto the back of the droplet by aiming the torch right down, straight down onto each one. What you'll see happen is you'll see the solder form its own little droplet at first. It'll bead up and then it will flatten out onto the face. And it just takes a second here. 1001, 1002, up, done. Okay, so that was quick and easy. Go ahead and turn off your torch. The next step is going to be to solder these onto our plate. Go ahead and apply some flux to your plate here. Then you're going to flip each one over and simply place it where you want it to go. I'm going to make a little cluster here. You can also add another droplet here. What I like to do is, if I have more than that, I go ahead and I squeeze the end of this here, touch the tip down here, and then I suck up the extra solder. So that, or not solder, sorry, flux off the piece. Once you have it arranged the way you like it, go ahead and light your torch again. And we're going to go with a smaller medium flame here again. And we're just going to be heating this up around the edges so that I can concentrate most of the heat onto the plate, because what we want to have happen is we want the sheet to get hot so that the heat of the sheet, not the heat of the flame, melts the solder that's already on the underside of each of these droplets. If we just heat up the droplets, all that's going to happen is the solder is going to heat up and then melt over the top of the droplet following the heat. So we got to get the heat mostly on the sheet here. So if you need to, you can dial your flame back so that it's really small. Sometimes it's easier to turn your torch off and then back on again. So now I've got a really small flame here with just a small blue tip. And I'm going to aim this right at my sheet here. Now, if you have magnification, sometimes it helps because then you can see when the solder melts. But what you're going to be looking for is that solder should flow out onto the sheet just under each droplet, so they'll form this little ring of silver color where the two touch. There you go. When you see that happen, and you can see here that little bits of silver color right there, that's the solder that flowed. So at this point, I'm definitely going to go ahead and put this in the pickle. And because I've done multiple soldering operations on this, it'll need to pickle for quite a while. So we'll go ahead and leave that in there for a couple of hours and come back and pull it out. Okay, real quick, while that's in the pickle, I want to go over an alternative way of setting up that soldering project to make it a little easier for you. This is a soldering tripod stand. It's pretty simple. It just consists of this tripod here and a wire mesh that goes on top. Now, with that previous setup, I had to heat the piece from above, which wasn't ideal. This is a much better way to do it. You would simply set your piece on top here and then apply the heat from beneath. This would actually isolate most of the heat right on the sheet, right where you want it, and you wouldn't have to get it nearly as hot in order to get the solder to melt. So this is a great tool to have, especially if you're doing larger pieces and you find that you're going to need to do soldering from below. And I believe I've used this in one of my other videos. So if you don't have one of these already, by now it's probably a good idea to go ahead and pick one up. Hey, we're back. It's been a couple hours. Let's check and see how this is doing. That looks great. So you can see all of the black has been removed. The piece has a nice uniform silver tone. And so we're done with the pickling. Don't forget to turn off your crock pot. If you ever forget to turn off your crock pot, then what happens is all your moisture in the pickle evaporates. If that happens, don't worry, just add more water and it will come back to life. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. That's all I wanted to cover, was just making the droplets and soldering them onto a piece of flat plate. The purpose of this is to show you that you don't have to try to put the solder on joints between different objects if it's going to be really difficult to get the solder to flow where you want it to. This is especially true with smaller pieces, so you can apply the solder to the smaller piece first and then heat up the larger piece. You can also do the opposite by putting some solder right on the big piece where you want to attach the smaller piece later, and then after you've cleaned it up, put the small piece on top of the solder, heat up the small item, which will then melt the large one, causing the solder to flow and connecting everything together. So our next class, we're going to be oxidizing some silver. So I'm going to show you how to take this piece and apply a patina, which is that black background that you'll see on a lot of silver jewelry. And I will cover the materials list at the beginning of the next video. Thanks for watching.